His family hired lawyers. His neighbors expected millions. His accountant had already drafted the inheritance paperwork. They were all wrong. When Harold Jarvis died alone in his farmhouse in November 2019, no wife, no children, no close friends to speak of. The people who thought they knew him assumed the worst. A bitter, reclusive old man who had hoarded everything and shared nothing. A man who had turned his back on the world, and so the world had turned its back on him. That was the story Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had told itself about Harold for nearly 30 years. His estate was worth $4.7 million. Every single cent went to the Millbrook County Animal Shelter, a 12-kennel operation that had been on the verge of shutting down for 2 years straight. Not a portion. Not a trust fund with conditions attached. Not a carefully worded charitable remainder that still left something for distant relatives or old colleagues. The entire estate, every account, every asset, every acre of land, unconditional, final, not open to challenge. The shelter director, a woman named Patricia Owens, did not even know Harold's last name when the call first came. She had to ask the attorney on the phone to repeat it. She asked 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of her office and stayed there for a while. And here is what makes this story stranger than it already sounds. Harold Jarvis never once adopted an animal from that shelter. He never volunteered a single hour of his time. He never showed up at a fundraiser, never put his name on a sponsorship list. I never sent so much as a handwritten card during the annual giving campaign. His neighbors described him as cold, difficult, a man who did not want to be known, and who had succeeded completely at that goal. So why did a man the entire town had written off as a recluse leave everything he had ever earned to save the animals nobody wanted? The answer reaches back further than most people expected. It moves through grief and loss and a kind of love so private that it never once asked to be seen. And by the time you understand what Harold was actually doing with those 30 years of silence, the word recluse will not fit him anymore. It will not come close. The Millbrook shelter was 3 months from closing its doors permanently when that call came through. 147 animals were facing transfer to high-kill facilities in neighboring counties. The staff had not received full pay in 6 months. The building's boiler had failed twice that winter and been patched rather than replaced because there was no money for anything else. Harold's bequest did not just save the shelter, it rebuilt it from the foundation up. And in the process of doing that, it uncovered a story that nobody in Millbrook had seen coming, a story about what it looks like when a person decides to let their actions speak after they are gone, when they decide that the one sentence worth finishing out loud is written in a will rather than spoken to a neighbor. This is that story. Harold Jarvis was 79 years old when he died. He had lived in the same 2-story farmhouse on the eastern edge of Millbrook for 51 years. The house sat on 14 acres of unworked land, bordered on one side by a drainage creek and on the other by a soybean field that belonged to a family named Whitmore. The driveway was gravel and long. The front porch had not been painted since the mid-1990s. His mail piled up visibly in the box by the road, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. The town had a whole vocabulary for Harold Jarvis. Difficult, withdrawn, strange. A few of the older residents who had known Millbrook before the 1990s would occasionally offer a more complicated word, changed, but that nuance mostly got lost in the retelling. What people saw was a man who had opted out, closed himself off, built a perimeter around his life, and enforced it with silence and distance. His closest neighbor, a woman named Diane Reyes, who lived about a quarter-mile down the same road, told the Millbrook Gazette that she had tried once, early on, after she moved in. A snowstorm in January of 2003 had knocked the power out across the whole stretch of road, and Diane had baked a pie and walked it over. A gesture, an opening. Harold had answered the door, looked at the pie, looked at her, said nothing, taken the pie, and closed the door. She never tried again. She said she did not blame herself for that. She just did not know what to do with a silence that complete. What Diane did not know, what almost nobody in Millbrook knew, was what was happening inside that farmhouse, what Harold was doing with all those years of silence, books, thousands of them, and stacked floor to ceiling in every room of the house except the kitchen and the master bedroom. The living room had been converted entirely into shelving. The second bedroom had no bed in it. The hallway was navigable only in single file. A local estate appraiser who was brought in after Harold's death described it as the most organized private library she had ever seen in a residential property. Every book was shelved by subject, then by author, then by date of publication. Every shelf was labeled in Harold's small, precise handwriting with a strip of white masking tape. The subjects were not random: veterinary medicine, animal psychology, wildlife biology, zoology, ethology, which is the study of animal behavior in natural conditions, memoirs of conservationists and wildlife rehabilitators, clinical case studies, surgical technique manuals that were 40 years out of date, but still meticulously annotated. Academic journals going back to 1978, bound in annual volumes with Harold's own indexing system tucked into each front cover. Post-it notes on nearly every page, not casual underlining or dog-eared corners. Actual, engaged, responsive notes, arguments with the author, questions in the margins, connections drawn between one book and another with tiny arrows and page references. The notes of someone who was not just reading, but thinking continuously over decades about a subject he never stopped taking seriously. The appraiser who first walked through the collection noted something specific about the temporal dimension of the annotations. You could watch Harold's thinking develop across the decades if you moved through the shelves in order. The earlier notes, from the 1970s and 1980s when Harold was a practicing vet, were practitioner's notes, observations about technique, skepticism about clinical claims, questions about application in field conditions. The notes from the 1990s and early 2000s had a different quality, more philosophical, more interested in the ethics of animal welfare than in its mechanics, more engaged with questions about what animals experience and what that experience means for how humans are obligated to treat them. The later notes, from the last decade of his life, were quieter, more certain, less argumentative and more observational, the notes of someone who had thought a question through to whatever resolution it was going to reach, and was now just recording observations rather than having debates. You could read the library as a biography, if you knew how to look at it. Harold never wrote a memoir. He did not need to. The margins of 4,000 books contained everything he was willing to say about what his life had been like, and what it had meant, and what he believed. This was not a man who did not care. This was not a man who had given up on the world. This was a man who cared about something very specific, in a language that happened to be invisible to everyone around him. And he had spent half a century doing it alone, without once asking for anyone's permission or acknowledgement. When you understand that, the $4.7 million starts to make a different kind of sense. The call came to Millbrook Animal Shelter on December 4th, 2019. A Tuesday morning, just before 9 o'clock, Patricia Owens had been in early, as she usually was, dealing with the overnight intake reports. She was at her desk filling out paperwork. The paperwork was for a 7-year-old beagle named Copper, who had been at the shelter for 93 days without a single adoption inquiry. 93 days was the facility's practical limit given their space constraints. The paperwork Patricia was filling out was a euthanasia order. She hated that part of the job more than anything else. She had been doing it for 16 years, and she had never once gotten used to it. She told a reporter later that she had developed a system for herself, a kind of emotional discipline, where she focused entirely on the mechanics of the paperwork while she was filling it out, and did not let herself think about the animal by name until after the form was submitted. Copper was not copper while she was writing. Copper was a case number, and a weight, and a breed classification. The phone rang. She answered it on the second ring out of habit, still looking at the form. The attorney on the other end of the line introduced himself as representing the estate of Harold William Jarvis of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. He said Patricia's shelter was the sole named beneficiary. He said the total value of the estate was approximately $4.7 million. He asked if she was available to meet later that week, to begin the transfer process. Patricia put the phone down on the desk without hanging up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked it back up and asked the attorney to repeat what he had just said. He did. She asked for a callback number and a bar association registration and told him she would call him back. She hung up. She walked to the front desk and asked her volunteer coordinator, a retired teacher named Marcus Webb, to cover for her for a few minutes. She went out to her car in the parking lot. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She stayed there for 45 minutes. When she came back inside, Marcus asked if everything was okay, and she told him she was not sure yet. She called the attorney back. She called the Millbrook County Courthouse to verify the probate filing. She called a lawyer friend in Harrisburg who specialized in estate law and read her the key provisions of the will over the phone. Her friend told her it was legitimate. Ironclad, actually. Harold had worked with a well-regarded estate attorney in Allentown. The will had been properly executed, properly witnessed, and filed with the county court. There were no outstanding legal challenges, no family members with standing to contest, largely because Harold had no living immediate family, and the distant relatives who had surfaced since his death had no prior relationship documented with the estate or with Harold himself. The shelter was going to receive $4.7 million, unconditionally. Patricia sat in her car a second time after the confirmation call, this time for less long. Something had shifted between the first time and the second. The first time she had been sitting with disbelief. The second time she was sitting with something harder to name, a feeling adjacent to grief, she said later, though she was not sure exactly whose grief it was. It was the grief of copper in the bottom drawer. It was the grief of knowing how close the shelter had been to the edge. It was also, she thought, something on Harold's behalf, a sadness for the 30 years of a man's interior life that had never quite found a way out. She did not know Harold. She did not know if what she was feeling on his behalf was anything close to accurate. It just settled on her in the parking lot, briefly, before she got out of the car and went back inside. Patricia went back to her desk. She looked at Copper's paperwork. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the 7-year-old beagle in Kennel 14 who had been there for 93 days and who had never, in all that time, stopped wanting to be petted when a person walked past. She put the paperwork in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet and closed the drawer. She did not submit it that day. She did not submit it the next day either. By the end of the week, when the reality of the bequest had begun to sink in, she went back to Copper's kennel and sat on the floor outside it for a long time, just talking to him quietly. He put his nose through the chain link, and she scratched it. The estate included the farmhouse and 14 acres, 2 brokerage accounts totaling $3.1 million, a life insurance policy worth $800,000, and approximately $700,000 in physical assets, a small vehicle collection, the rare book library, various tools and equipment in the barn. Harold had been careful and methodical about money for a very long time. He lived on almost nothing. He maintained the farmhouse minimally but adequately. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck. He did not travel. He did not spend on luxuries of any kind. He had been accumulating quietly, without fanfare or apparent purpose, for decades. The purpose, it turned out, had been there all along. He just had not told anyone what it was. Attached to the will was one handwritten note. Not an explanation, not a letter, not the kind of extended personal statement that some people leave behind. 8 words. Written in the same small, precise hand that had annotated 4,000 books. They never asked anything of me. Take care of them. That was everything Harold Jarvis left the world in terms of words. 8 words, $4.7 million, and a silence that was starting, only now, to become readable. Think about what that ratio means for a moment, and while you are thinking about it, consider one more number. The Millbrook County Animal Shelter had been operating at roughly $180,000 per year at the time Harold died. The national average annual budget for a shelter of similar size and intake volume sits somewhere between $300,000 and $700,000. Millbrook was not just underfunded by normal standards. It was running at roughly half the floor of what the industry considered a minimum viable budget. Patricia had been covering gaps with her own credit card. She had been paying her 2 most senior staff out of a discretionary account that was not designed for payroll. She had been for years performing the particular financial acrobatics of a person trying to stretch inadequate resources across non-negotiable needs and doing it without complaint. Because what was the alternative? The average American donates roughly 2% of their income to charitable causes over the course of a lifetime. 2% after a lifetime of earning and spending and saving is considered generous by most standards. Harold Jarvis donated 100% of everything he had ever accumulated to a single organization. Not in his will's first draft, not in a codicil added in the last months of his life when sentimentality can sometimes override judgment. The Millbrook County Animal Shelter was the named beneficiary in every version of Harold's will going back to 1991. The estate attorney in Allentown confirmed this when he was interviewed after the story broke. Harold had come in to update the will 3 times over the decades to adjust specific asset listings as his portfolio grew to account for the life insurance policy he had taken out in 2007 to add a clause clarifying the disposition of the book collection. In every version, the shelter was the only beneficiary. It never changed. 28 years. He held that intention for 28 years without telling them, without any apparent need to be acknowledged for it, without any visible relationship with the organization that would receive everything he had. He just kept the shelter in his will the way some people keep a photograph in their wallet, privately, permanently, without needing to explain it to anyone. He just waited. To understand why, you have to go back further. Back to before the farmhouse became a fortress. Back to before the town decided it knew what Harold was. James Carver was a reporter at the Millbrook Gazette who had been covering local news for almost 20 years when Harold's story broke in December 2019. He had the particular combination of patience and stubbornness that good local journalists develop over years of working stories that nobody else considers worth following. He knew Millbrook the way someone who has covered a place for 2 decades knows it. So not just its public face, but its texture, the difference between what people say and what they mean, the threads that connect events separated by years. He was not particularly looking for a story when he found Harold's. He picked up the probate filing as a matter of routine, scanning the public record the way small-town reporters do. $4.7 million going to a struggling local animal shelter was, by any measure, out of the ordinary. He started making calls. Those calls turned into months of reporting, and the months of reporting turned into a picture of Harold Jarvis that the town of Millbrook had never seen. What Carver found rewrote the entire narrative. Harold Jarvis had not always been a recluse. That word, that story, only applied to approximately the last third of his life. Before that, a Harold was something different altogether. In the 1970s, Harold had been a veterinary technician and then a licensed veterinarian running a large animal practice out of the same farmhouse where he would later seal himself away from the world. His practice served the agricultural community in a 30-mile radius around Millbrook: dairy farms, horse operations, the small livestock holdings that dotted rural Pennsylvania. He drove to his patients. He was known for being available at odd hours, for returning calls the same day, for charging farmers fairly when he could have charged them more. By all the accounts Carver was able to gather from people still living in the area who remembered those years, Harold had been well regarded. More than that, genuinely liked. He had a warmth that the later Harold made it almost impossible to imagine. He had a wife. Her name was Eleanor Marsh before she married him, and Eleanor Jarvis after. And she was by every account a large presence in both the practice and the community. She helped with the administrative side of the veterinary work. She organized the accounts, scheduled the calls, kept Harold from losing track of the practical dimensions of running a business that he would have happily left entirely to chance if left to his own devices. She was, by the description of people who knew them both, the part of Harold that faced outward. He was excellent at his work and comfortable with people in the context of that work, but Eleanor was the one who remembered birthdays, who brought food to sick neighbors, who made Millbrook feel like a place they both belonged to, rather than just a place they happened to live. They had a marriage that people who knew them described with an almost uniform vocabulary. Words like steady, solid, built rather than found. They were not a dramatic couple. They did not display affection publicly in ways that made other people uncomfortable or envious. They were simply, consistently, visibly a unit. Where Harold was methodical and interior, Eleanor was warm and outward-facing. Where Harold communicated through the precision of his work, Eleanor communicated through conversation, through remembering details about people's lives, through the ordinary acts of neighborliness that build a community's social fabric one small gesture at a time. They were not opposites exactly, but they were different in ways that turned out to be complementary rather than abrasive. Each of them was more fully themselves, because the other was there. They had a dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, which Eleanor had chosen and Harold had initially tolerated, and then, by all observable evidence, adored without reservation. Biscuit went everywhere with Harold on farm calls. Farmers remembered the dog more vividly than they remembered Harold in some cases. Biscuit riding shotgun in the old truck, Biscuit waiting patiently outside a barn while Harold worked. Biscuit's particular habit of putting his enormous head in the lap of whoever was sitting nearest to him, uninvited, with total confidence in his welcome. In 1989, Eleanor was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She was 44 years old. The diagnosis came after a year of symptoms that both of them had been explaining away in the ways that people do when the alternative explanation is too large to look at directly. Misplaced keys, repeated questions, Small words that slipped away mid-sentence and had to be retrieved with visible effort. Harold was a veterinarian. He understood cognition and neurological deterioration in a clinical sense. He had treated animals with the canine equivalent of cognitive decline. He knew what the pattern meant before the doctor in Allentown said it out loud. He just needed someone else to say it out loud before he could begin dealing with it. Harold shuttered his veterinary practice within a month of the diagnosis. He did not transfer his patients to other practices gradually or wind the business down over time. He stopped. He called his clients and referred them to practitioners in surrounding counties and returned deposits on scheduled work. He came home, and he did not leave again, except for Eleanor's medical appointments and the grocery runs that kept the household running. He cared for Eleanor for 2 years. The disease moved faster than the doctors had initially projected. By the 2nd year, she did not consistently recognize him. By the last months, she did not recognize herself in mirrors. Harold did not hire additional nursing help until the physical demands exceeded what one person could manage alone. The neighbors who occasionally glimpsed him during that period described a man who had disappeared into a task, who had shrunk himself down to the dimensions required by a single purpose. He was not unhappy, they said, or at least not visibly. He was focused in a way that had no room for anything outside it. There is a particular kind of love that expresses itself entirely through action, and almost never through speech. Harold had always been that kind. Eleanor had been the one who put it into language. She translated him to the world and the world to him. And as long as she was there, the translation worked smoothly enough that most people never noticed it was happening. When she was gone, the translation stopped. Not the love, just the version of it that other people could see. Harold Jarvis died in March of 1991. She was 46 years old. Biscuit died in September of the same year. Harold never practiced veterinary medicine again. He never reopened the practice, never worked as a technician, never consulted. The license lapsed eventually for lack of renewal. He did not pursue new relationships of any significance. He did not attend Eleanor's memorial gathering, which her family organized without him because he had said he could not be there. He went inside the farmhouse, and he began the long project of becoming invisible to the town that surrounded him. He was 51 years old. He had 30 years ahead of him. He did not know that at the time, of course. He did not know what he had ahead of him at all, which is both the most frightening thing about grief and, in some cases, the thing that allows a person to keep moving through it. He was going to spend most of those 30 years alone, and inside those walls, with those books, being misread by everyone who drove past on the county road. People in Millbrook had theories, the way people always develop theories about neighbors they cannot explain. Some assumed he was depressed, clinically and chronically, and were not entirely wrong. Some assumed he had financial problems and was embarrassed by them, which was almost perfectly backward. Some assumed he simply disliked people, which missed the point so completely it almost becomes sad in retrospect. A few of the older residents who remembered Harold before Eleanor got sick would sometimes say, quietly, that what had happened was that he had never figured out how to be Harold, without Eleanor there to help him do it. That version was the closest. It was not the whole truth, but it was pointed in the right direction. What nobody in Millbrook knew was what Harold was doing with the money. He lived on almost nothing since 1991. The farmhouse was paid off. He had no dependents. He ate simply, did not travel, and had no expensive habits of any kind. His veterinary practice, while modest, had been profitable, and he had saved carefully during those years. After Eleanor died, what had previously been a comfortable but unremarkable savings situation began, slowly and then less slowly, to grow. Harold was not investing aggressively or doing anything sophisticated. He simply had more money arriving through conservative investments than he was spending, and he let the difference compound over time with a patience that most people do not maintain, because most people find other uses for money before it has 30 years to quietly multiply. By the time Harold died in 2019, that patience had produced $4.7 million. Every cent of which was already spoken for. But he did not stop reading. He did not stop studying. He did not stop thinking about animals, or about the science of their care, or about the systems, the shelters, the rescue networks, the welfare organizations that tried to catch the ones that fell through the cracks of human attention. He subscribed to veterinary journals. He built the library. He kept his own quiet record of the field advancing without him. He did not participate. He watched, he read, he made notes in the margins of books late at night in a house with no one else in it. And sometime in 1991, within months of losing Eleanor and then Biscuit, he walked into an estate attorney's office in Allentown and wrote the Millbrook County Animal Shelter into his will as the sole beneficiary of everything he had. He never told them. He never asked for anything from them. He drove past the shelter on his rare trips into town and gave no outward sign of any connection to it whatsoever. He was not building a relationship with an institution. He was making a promise to something that could not hear him make it, could not thank him for it, could not ask why. They never asked anything of me. Take care of them. When you read it in that context, it is not 8 words. It is 28 years, compressed into 8 words. It is a man explaining, as briefly as possible, the only thing left that had felt clean and possible after the world he had built around Eleanor and Biscuit had been taken apart by time and disease and ordinary loss. The animals in that shelter had not known him. They did not have expectations of him. They did not need him to be the version of himself that had existed before 1989. They just needed to survive, and he could arrange for that, quietly, over a lifetime, without anyone needing to know about it, until there was nothing left of him to be modest about. Patricia Owens convened an emergency board meeting within 2 weeks of verifying the bequest. There were 7 board members present. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Nobody cried during the meeting itself, though several people cried afterward in the parking lot. The decisions the board made over the following months were methodical and careful in a way that felt, to those involved, like a kind of obligation. Harold had been meticulous about his life and about his money. The least they could do was be meticulous about how they used it. Phase 1 of the rebuilding addressed the immediate crisis. $600,000 retired all outstanding institutional debt, brought staff wages fully current including back pay, and funded the emergency infrastructure repairs the building needed, the boiler, the ventilation system in the kennel block, the drainage problem in the outdoor exercise area that had been a known issue for 3 years. The animals already in the facility received upgraded care immediately. The euthanasia orders that had been pending for space constraint reasons were paused, and then eliminated. Copper the beagle, who had been 93 days into a process that was moving toward its end, was given a new timeline. He was adopted by a family in Harrisburg 4 weeks after the bequest was publicly announced. He was renamed. Patricia keeps his original intake photo on her desk. Phase 2 committed $1.2 million to construction. A new wing, 40 additional kennels with individual climate control, a surgical suite equipped to handle the kind of cases that had previously required transfer to specialist facilities, a behavioral rehabilitation room designed for animals with trauma histories that made standard kennel environments counterproductive to their recovery, and a dedicated senior animal ward for animals over 10 years old who faced dramatically lower adoption rates, and who had previously been among the most likely candidates for euthanasia when space ran low. The new wing was named the Harold and Eleanor Jarvis Wing. Patricia made that decision herself and brought it to the board as a recommendation rather than a question. She did not frame it as a vote. She framed it as an obvious obligation. The board approved it without discussion. It felt, everyone agreed, like the minimum thing they could do with an 8-word note, and a life's work left entirely to their discretion. The naming mattered to Patricia in a way that went beyond the practical. She had thought a lot in the months after the bequest about what Harold might have wanted from all of this. Whether he would have been comfortable with the public attention, whether the letters and the news coverage and the outpouring from strangers was the kind of thing he would have recognized as good or experienced as an intrusion. She did not know him. She still does not really, not in the way that proximity and time allow a person to know another person. She knows the outline, the will, the library, the 8 words. But she had decided, based on everything Carver's reporting had uncovered about Eleanor and Biscuit and the years before the farmhouse became a fortress, that Harold was not a man who wanted his name on nothing. He was a man who wanted a specific name on something. He had been carrying Eleanor for 30 years, inside a life that looked from the outside like it had nothing in it. Off putting her name on the wing where the oldest and most overlooked animals in the county would receive care felt, to Patricia, like the closest approximation available to what Harold had actually been trying to do with all that time and all that money. She told a journalist in 2021 that she hoped, wherever Harold was, he thought the name was right. She paused after saying it and added that she thought he probably would not have cared about his own name at all. But Eleanor's, she thought he would have wanted that. Phase 3 established an endowment. $2 million, professionally managed, with a conservative investment mandate and a spending policy designed to generate operating funds in perpetuity. It was the first endowment in the shelter's 22-year history. The endowment, invested at a 5% average annual return, generates approximately $100,000 per year without touching the principal. Combined with the municipal allocation the shelter receives and its regular donation income, the organization now operates at a budget level that exceeds the national average for shelters of its size. It is not just stable. It is genuinely secure in a way that very few animal welfare organizations of its type ever manage to become. For the first time in its existence, the Millbrook shelter achieved no-kill certification in 2021. They have maintained it every year since. Adoption rates climbed 340% in the 18 months following the construction completion. The transfer agreements with high-kill facilities in neighboring counties, which had been a grim ongoing feature of the shelter's operational reality for years, were formally canceled. The shelter now takes overflow from 2 neighboring counties rather than sending animals away. The numbers are real and they matter. But the number that stays with people who hear this story is not the 4.7 million, or the 340% adoption increase, or the $2 million endowment. It is the 8 words, and it is Copper's photo on Patricia's desk. When the Associated Press picked up the story in January 2020, the response was immediate and large in a way that local stories rarely achieve. The AP wire carried it nationally, and several major outlets ran their own versions within 48 hours. The Millbrook Shelter's donation webpage crashed within 6 hours of the first wave of coverage. When the site came back online, donations came in from 47 states. By the end of the first week, $218,000 in additional gifts had arrived from strangers who had never heard of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, before reading about Harold. But the financial response, large as it was was almost beside the point compared to what else arrived. Letters. Physical letters, sent by mail, addressed to Patricia Owens by name at the shelter. She received over 400 of them in the first month. She has said in interviews since that she did not anticipate the letters. She expected donations, calls from journalists, maybe some volunteer inquiries. She did not expect the letters. She read every one. Most of them were short, a paragraph or two. Most of them said some version of the same thing across their different handwritings and different return addresses scattered across 47 states. Some said, "I knew someone like this." Some said, "I am someone like this." Some said, "I never thought about doing something like this, but now I cannot stop thinking about it." A few said things that were harder to summarize. Accounts of loss, of animals who had mattered, of the particular kind of love that does not translate well into the language of everyday conversation, and so mostly goes unsaid, until someone like Harold Jarvis proves it can be said in another way entirely. Patricia saved the letters. All 400 and some odd of them, in a filing box in her office. She has said she is not sure why exactly. She does not go back to them regularly, but they feel like part of the story in a way that she has not been able to bring herself to discard. They are evidence that Harold's final sentence reached further than Millbrook, that the 8 words landed in places Harold never could have imagined, and did something in those places that Patricia cannot fully account for, but recognizes as real. A retired couple from Ashland, Oregon, drove to Millbrook specifically to volunteer. They called ahead and asked if they could help. They stayed for 3 months. They adopted a 12-year-old cat from the senior ward before they left. A woman in Columbus, Ohio, sent a letter, not a donation, just a letter, explaining that she was in the process of updating her own will and that Harold's story had clarified something she had been uncertain about for years. She was leaving her estate to her local animal shelter. She wanted Patricia to know that Harold had, in some indirect but real way, given her permission to do something she had wanted to do but had not been able to fully commit to before. Planned giving departments at animal welfare organizations across the country reported a measurable increase in inquiries in the months following Harold's story. The American Pet Products Association, which tracks philanthropic trends in animal welfare, cited the Jarvis bequest as a contributing factor in a broader shift in legacy giving toward animal welfare causes that became statistically visible by the end of 2020. Harold Jarvis, who had spent 3 decades being invisible to the world, created a national conversation after he died. About planned giving, yes, but also about something harder to quantify, about what it means to carry a purpose privately for a very long time, about the gap between how a person appears to the people around them, and what is actually happening inside the life they have built behind that appearance. The farmhouse and its 14 acres were sold at auction in September 2020. Before the sale, Patricia formally requested access to the property for documentation purposes. The estate attorney facilitated the request, and Patricia spent 3 days at the farmhouse with a small team cataloging what Harold had left behind. What they cataloged was the library. 4,312 books, and 94% of them related to veterinary science, animal behavior, or wildlife conservation. Harold had continued purchasing new titles and subscribing to new journals well into the final years of his life. The most recent purchase date visible in the collection was 11 weeks before his death. He had ordered a new edition of a standard veterinary pharmacology reference and received it and put it on the shelf and made a note in the front cover about which chapters superseded the edition he already owned. The annotations throughout the collection were consistent across decades. The handwriting changed slightly, more economical in the later years, slightly larger as his eyesight aged. But the quality of engagement did not diminish. If anything, the notes became more precise over time, less exploratory and more settled. The marginalia of someone who had thought about these questions long enough to have real positions, rather than just questions. The library was offered first to the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, which accepted the donation with what the dean described in a written statement as profound gratitude. Before the formal transfer, the veterinary librarian who led the cataloging assessment spent 3 weeks at the farmhouse, working through the collection, shelf by shelf, box by box, writing her formal report. She later published a short essay in a veterinary education journal about what the experience of cataloging Harold's library had been like. She described a quality in the annotations that she found difficult to name precisely. They were not the notes of a student or a casual reader. They were not even exactly the notes of a practitioner keeping current with the field. They were more like the notes of someone in active dialogue with a subject that still mattered to them, who was still responding to new information and integrating it with what they already knew, who had not stopped thinking about the clinical and ethical questions of animal welfare just because they had stopped practicing. She wrote that walking through the collection was, in some ways, like walking through someone's thinking process extended across 50 years, like being allowed to watch a mind at work in real time, except the real time was half a century, and the mind was no longer there to explain itself. She ended the essay with a note that the collection had been donated anonymously by the estate of a veterinarian who had never stopped caring about the animals he could no longer treat. A veterinary librarian who spent 3 weeks cataloging and assessing the collection before the formal transfer described it publicly as a practitioner's archive, unlike anything she had encountered from a private collection. The annotations alone, she said, represented a kind of longitudinal record of how one experienced vet had tracked and thought about the development of the field over 50 years. It had research value beyond the individual volumes. In the master bedroom of the farmhouse, in an old cedar chest at the foot of the bed, Patricia's team found one photograph. A single framed photograph, 5 by 7 inches, black and white. Harold and Eleanor on their wedding day in 1973. They are standing outside a church in what appears to be early fall light. Eleanor is laughing at something outside the frame. Harold is not looking at the camera. He is looking at Eleanor. Between them, sitting at their feet with enormous dignity and wearing what appears to be a carefully knotted fabric bow tie, is a golden retriever, Biscuit. One of the cataloging volunteers, a young woman who had not known much of Harold's story before coming to the farmhouse that week, found the photograph. She carried it out to Patricia, who was working in the living room, without saying anything. She just handed it over. Patricia looked at it for a long time. She looked at Harold, looking at Eleanor. She looked at Biscuit in the bow tie. She said, later, and that was the first time since the call in December that she had cried. The photograph now hangs in the Harold and Eleanor Jarvis wing of the Millbrook County Animal Shelter in the corridor between the surgical suite and the senior animal ward. Patricia had it properly matted and framed. She put it at eye level, centered on the wall, in a spot where the staff passes it multiple times every day. There is a small brass plaque below it. It reads, Harold William Jarvis, 1940 to 2019, Eleanor Marsh. Jarvis, 1945 to 1991. And then the 8 words, verbatim, as Harold wrote them. They never asked anything of me. Take care of them. The instinct when a story like this reaches its end is to resolve it cleanly, to call it heartwarming, and let that be enough. Harold was a good person who did a generous thing, and the animals are saved, and the shelter is thriving, and the story has a bow on it, and we can feel the particular pleasant feeling that comes from a world that occasionally, improbably, works out. But there is something underneath the sentimentality that is worth staying with for a moment longer. Harold Jarvis spent nearly 30 years being misread by the people around him. Not maliciously misread. Diane Reyes was not a cruel person for not trying again after the pie. The town of Millbrook was not wrong to draw the conclusions it drew from the evidence it had. Harold gave them very little to work with. He gave them a closed door and a long driveway and a mailbox that overflowed, and that was the entire visible surface of his life. What they could not see, what he never offered them and never asked them to look for, was what the grief had done to him, and what he had done with the grief in return. He had lost the person who faced outward for him. He had lost the animal who expected nothing and gave everything. And rather than rebuild a life that looked like the one before, he went inward. He kept the one thing that had always been his, the knowledge, the care, the genuine expertise in the welfare of creatures who could not advocate for themselves. And he practiced it in private, in the margins of books, in a will that nobody would read, until he was gone. That is not the same thing as giving up. It does not look like giving up from the inside. It might be the only form that giving can take. For someone whose capacity for outward-facing love has been used up entirely by loss. He was not cold, he was spent. He was doing the only thing left that felt possible, taking care of something, from a distance, in the one language he had left that still worked. There are people in every town who look like Harold Jarvis from the outside, difficult neighbors, strange loners, people who do not respond to pies or to small talk or to the ordinary gestures of community that most people find easy. The instinct is to write them off. The instinct is understandable and human, and in most individual cases probably harmless. Harold himself made it easy. He was not asking to be understood. He had stopped asking for anything from the town a long time ago. But Harold Jarvis left $4.7 million and 8 words to prove that the visible surface of a life is not the life, that grief and love can occupy the same person simultaneously, invisibly, for decades, that the most significant thing a person does may be entirely invisible until they are gone, that some people's greatest acts are legible only in retrospect, only after the door is finally open and someone walks through it and starts reading what was accumulated inside. There is also something in Harold's story that speaks directly to the question of what we owe each other as strangers in the same town. Diane Reyes brought the pie once and got a closed door. She did not try again, and that was reasonable. But Harold was not hostile. He was not mean. He was just a man who did not have language left for ordinary social exchange. He had used all of it up on something else. The pie was kindness that arrived in a form he could not receive. That is not anyone's fault. It is just how grief sometimes works on people, narrowing the bandwidth for connection until almost nothing gets through. What could have gotten through to Harold, if anything, is probably unknowable now. What we know is what did get through. The books, the journals, the animals in the shelter 3 miles down the road who did not know his name, and did not need to. James Carver spent 2 years reporting the full story. He published a long-form piece in Pennsylvania Magazine in 2022 that went deeper than anything the original wire coverage had reached. The piece contained one final detail that no one had previously reported. Harold Jarvis had been the anonymous donor behind the Millbrook shelter's single largest prior donation in its history up to that point. Carver had been sitting on the lead for months before he could verify it sufficiently to include in the piece. He had found a reference in a board meeting minute from 2004 that mentioned the anonymous $50,000 cashier's check as a line item under gifts received. The original note said only that the gift had arrived without a return address, postmarked Allentown, and that the board intended to make efforts to identify and acknowledge the donor. A follow-up note from a board meeting the following year said those efforts had been unsuccessful. Carver had worked the Allentown angle carefully. Harold's estate attorney, the probate records, on the known pattern of Harold's movements over the years. In 2004, the shelter had been the subject of a short article in the Millbrook Gazette about its financial difficulties. Carver had the original clip. He matched the publication date of the article to the postmark date on the cashier's check. They were 11 days apart. In 2004, 15 years before his death, the shelter had received a cashier's check for $50,000 with no return address and no accompanying note. The check had arrived in a plain envelope, postmarked from Allentown. The board had spent years making periodic low-level efforts to identify the donor, not to publicize them, but because they felt an obligation to at least acknowledge the gift to whoever had made it. They never found a match. The cashier's check was untraceable, by design. When Carver cross-referenced the date of the 2004 donation with Harold's financial records, which became accessible as part of the estate documentation, the withdrawal matched exactly. Same amount, same week. Allentown, where Harold's estate attorney was located, and where Harold had made periodic visits over the years. The match was not definitive proof by the standard of a court proceeding, but it was, as Carver wrote in the piece, as close to certain as circumstantial evidence can get. The shelter board, when Carver shared his finding before publication, sat with it quietly for a while. Patricia told him she was not surprised, which surprised her. It felt, she said, like the last piece of something that had been waiting to be found. Harold did not just plan his final act for 28 years. He had been practicing it the whole time. The $50,000 gift in 2004 had kept the shelter's lights on during what the board described as their worst operational year on record. Harold had known they were struggling. Local news coverage that year had included pieces about the shelter's financial precarity, and he had sent what he could at that moment without disrupting the larger accumulation that was still in progress. He was patient in a way that is genuinely rare. He held a purpose across decades, across his own isolation and grief, across the ordinary pressures that cause most intentions to dissolve. He sent a preview of what was coming 15 years early, anonymously, without any expectation of acknowledgement because the animals needed it then and he could arrange for it. And then he went back to waiting. There is a concept in psychology called disenfranchised grief. It refers to losses that society does not fully recognize as worthy of formal mourning. The loss of a pet is one of the most commonly cited examples. When a person loses a dog or a cat that has been a daily presence in their life, that has been a source of unconditional connection and routine and meaning, the grief is real and often severe. But the social scaffolding that surrounds human loss does not reliably show up for animal loss. People take bereavement days for spouses and parents. They do not usually take them for dogs. The casseroles do not arrive. The formal recognition is absent. Harold Jarvis lost Eleanor and Biscuit within 6 months of each other. The Eleanor loss was recognized, honored, formally marked with a service that Harold could not bring himself to attend. The Biscuit loss registered as nothing to anyone outside the farmhouse. Just a dog, just an old retriever that had been around for years. Just a thing that happens inside the farmhouse. It was not nothing. Biscuit had been the last living connection to the version of Harold that had existed before the illness. The dog had been present for all of it. The practice, the farm calls, the years of Harold and Eleanor building something together in Millbrook, the meals and the mornings and the ordinary texture of a life that had a shape. When Biscuit died 6 months after Eleanor, Harold lost the last witness, the last thing that had known him before. That is not a small loss. That is, depending on the person, potentially the decisive one. It is worth thinking about what Harold chose to do in the year that took both of them from him. He could have done nothing. He could have simply lived out the remaining decades in whatever form of numbness or withdrawal felt manageable. That would have been understandable. That would have been, by most human standards, completely forgivable. Grief of that magnitude does not come with obligations. But Harold went to an estate attorney in Allentown and made a promise. He picked the one organization he could identify that was doing the specific thing, sheltering and caring for animals who had no one else, and he made it the recipient of everything he was going to earn for the rest of his life. He could not bring Eleanor back. He could not bring Biscuit back. He could not undo the loss or build around it a new life that looked like the one before. But he could do this. He could accumulate and wait, and eventually transfer it all to somewhere that would use it. That decision, made in 1991 by a 51-year-old man sitting across from an estate attorney in a city he did not particularly want to be in, is what made everything else possible. The no-kill certification, the senior animal ward, Copper the beagle going home to a family in Harrisburg instead of going somewhere else. Harold did not know any of those specifics. He could not have. He was just making a promise to a future he would not live to see in its full form, trusting that the promise would hold, and that the organization on the other end of it would know what to do. It held. They knew what to do. The Millbrook County Animal Shelter as it exists today is not the same organization it was in 2019. The new wing is fully operational. The staff has grown from 7 to 14 full-time employees. The endowment is performing above its target. The no-kill certification has been renewed 3 years running. More than 1,100 animals have been adopted since the Jarvis wing opened. The senior animal ward, which Harold's bequest made possible, has placed animals as old as 15 into permanent homes, animals who would not have had a realistic path to adoption under the shelter's previous constraints. Patricia Owens still runs the shelter. She has been offered other positions. Larger organizations, bigger budgets, all the kind of career advancement that people in her field occasionally have available to them. And she has turned them all down. She says she is not finished with what she is doing in Millbrook. She does not use the word legacy in conversation, but the thing she is describing when she talks about the shelter's future is clearly related to that concept. She has started an education program that brings students from the local middle school in on quarterly visits. The program is designed to teach children about animal welfare and responsible ownership. But Patricia will tell you that is only the surface goal. The deeper goal is to give children regular exposure to the specific experience of being in a room with animals who have had difficult lives and who are, despite that, available for connection, who have not closed off, who are still trying. She does not explain it in exactly those terms to the school administration when she proposes the program's renewal each year. But that is what she is doing. She is trying to make something that lasts. She learned that from a man she never met, who held a 30-year promise to a shelter he never visited, who wrote 8 words and called it enough. It was enough. It turned out to be more than enough. Every year on the anniversary of Harold's death in November, the shelter staff gathers in the Jarvis wing before the building opens to the public. It is not a formal ceremony, and Patricia is deliberate about keeping it that way. There are no speeches. No one reads from anything. They bring their coffee and they sit with the animals in the early morning quiet of the wing, the dogs in their kennels, The cats in the communal room, the occasional rabbit or guinea pig in the small animal section, and they stay for an hour. There are usually between 8 and 12 people present, depending on the year and the staffing. Some of them knew about Harold before the story broke. Most did not. Several of the current staff were hired after the wing opened, which means Harold existed for them first as a name on a wall rather than as a news story. They have come to him in a different order than everyone else, from the inside of what he built rather than from the outside, looking in at what he was. Patricia has said that she thinks these newer staff members sometimes have the clearest view of Harold, precisely because they do not have the overlay of the Recluse narrative. To them, he is just the man whose name is on the building, which turns out to be the most important true thing about him. The hour in the wing before opening is quiet. The animals are calmer in the early morning before the public arrives, the energy of the building lower, the light through the east-facing windows long and pale. The staff members sit near the kennels or in the communal rooms and do not do much of anything except be there. A few of them talk quietly to the animals. A few of them just sit. It is, in the end, what Harold was doing for 30 years, sitting with it, being present to something he cared about without requiring the caring to look like anything in particular from the outside, showing up in the only way he still knew how. That is the whole story, or as much of it as can be told from the outside. The inside of it, what Harold actually felt during those 30 years, what Eleanor meant to him in the specific weight and texture of daily life, what it was like to be him on any given night in that farmhouse with the books and the journals and the notes he was writing for no one and then for everyone. That stays private. He kept it private deliberately and completely, and the privacy should be respected. He earned it. He decided what to make visible and what to keep. And the line he drew was clear. What he chose to leave visible was the will, the books, and one photograph with a bow-tied dog. That is enough. That is more than most people manage. That is, if you sit with it long enough, not a recluse's story. It is a love story that ran out of its original form and had to find another one, and found it, and held it across 30 years and $4.7 million and 8 words, and eventually delivered it to a shelter 3 miles down the road that needed it. More than he did. 1,100 animals alive who would not be. A shelter that will outlast everyone currently working in it. A veterinarian's library doing its work in a university collection, the marginalia of a man who never stopped thinking, still in conversation with readers who will never know his name. And 8 words that keep doing what Harold intended them to do, quietly, without fanfare, on their own, long after the person who wrote them is gone. They never asked anything of me. Take care of them. If this story reached you in some way, if it changed how you think about the quiet people in your orbit, or about what it means to hold a purpose for a long time, or about what you might want to leave behind, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me about your Harold, or tell me what your version of 8 words would be. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones that do not make the front page but probably should, the ones that take a minute to understand but stay with you after you do, hit subscribe. This is exactly what this channel is here for. Take care of them, and each other.